In this series, we're going to go over some chromatic harmony that has a little bit different approach than the typical secondary dominant kind of music, or the secondary functioning chords like the secondary dominant. The half diminished can act like a secondary functioning chord. The fully diminished sevenths, those all act, well, they can act like secondary functioning chords if you use them a certain way. They have that typical secondary functioning sound that you would hear with secondary tonicizing chords. Now this playlist is actually not going to be for everybody because it's going to give you a completely different sound, some of the approaches we take, than normal chromatic harmony would give you. So in other words, we're going to rely less on dominant style moves or leading tone style moves. Like, let me just go ahead and go through a few. I have a course on this basic chromatic harmony. Hundreds of royalty-free progressions, but these half diminished, fully diminished, dominant seventh all can resolve to this 2 chord in C. These are typical secondary functioning chords that tonicize chords within key. We're not going to deal with any of these, but you could take this course here, and I have hundreds of examples of royalty-free progressions you could use with stuff like augmented 6, all the secondary functioning tonicizing chords. And I apologize, I do have to do a little shameless plug. You could learn sequences like this. Typical secondary tonicizing chords. We're going to deal with less predictable situations like this. And there is actually something in here that I'm doing that is actually part of the natural order of circle of fifths. Half diminished, resolution, down a fifth. I did that twice in there. And let's talk about this. And I did all this within the key of A. It looked like Lydian at first because I did have a raised fourth, but it's not. So let's talk about this for a second. The natural order here for a second. I want to show you something. 4, 7, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. In key circle of fifth natural order. Where does the diminished chord go? 7, naturally to 3. The root of B naturally goes to the root of E in the circle of fifths. So a B half diminished naturally moves to some form of E. It could be E minor seventh, whatever. It naturally moves to it in that cycle. So you could use any half diminished and resolve to any minor seventh chord, or even just a minor chord, up a fifth or down a fourth. So in that example I did where I was improvising, I went from I was in A, okay, and I used a temporary half diminished seventh to go to the F minor seventh, and another half diminished seventh to go to the C sharp minor seventh in root position. So the first time I ran across this move was actually with Tchaikovsky, not jazz. So just an interesting observation. So in the key of C, we can temporarily use a half diminished a fourth or fifth away, depending on which way your root is. The A half diminished to D minor seventh. And if you look at B flat, 1, 4, 7, 3. We could kind of call this the half diminished seventh of 3 instead of like the 5 of 5 if you're using secondary dominants. Almost like a slang term to identify it. We could go to a dominant chord or the minor seventh chord, it doesn't matter. Because that root movement in the circle of fifths is natural order. So if I use C major and start on the half diminished, goes naturally to the 3. Now with one simple chromatic walk down, I could convert it to an A half diminished over E flat, and go to D minor seventh, and then finish up with a dominant chord to the C major seventh. And doing it musically, just somewhat, it'd sound like something like this. So, in other words, we're no longer relying on secondary functioning chords to tonicize chords. We're using chords that will still naturally go to that chord, instead of doing that. We're doing this. For a completely different sound that's way less predictable than, let's say, a secondary dominant. So you might want to just mess around with different inversions of this same sequence down here, just to get used to this process. I wrote out a really long sequence that I'll just play through it, and I'm going to do it musically. Here it is. Again. Now I am going to use one tonicizing chord, this F sharp diminished seventh, but to a 6/4 chord. Now the tritone substitution, but with the G in the bass, which is literally just like an augmented 6 chord, is pretty much the same thing. So let me go ahead and play back an example of this sequence musically, because I'm not a good enough piano player to do this kind of stuff. I'm a creator, not a piano player. So here it is. Now, I was using a lot of chromatic neighbor tones and stuff, not Lydian, just because look, I used a natural 4 there. Another chromatic neighbor tone. The move, the diminished, half diminished to the minor 7th, 2. Half diminished of the A minor 7th, more chromatic neighbor tones, tritone substitution and inversion, and then I just alternated between that and the tritone substitution, or augmented 6 chord. I don't care what term somebody uses, it's all relative at that point. So I'll go ahead and play back the sequence now that we went through it really slow. I just played it slow so you can, but I did mark the C as a C flat to imply that D flat 7 dominant chord with a flat 5 over the G, which would be the flat 5. Here's the example again after going through it slow. So again, this series is based on alternatives with chromatic harmony than the typical tonicizing chords of secondary dominance, and we're still using stuff like half diminished, but in a different way. Doesn't have that tonicizing effect. So basically, we're just trying to get a different sound out of something without being as predictable with our chord movement as secondary functioning chords.